Hello and welcome to today's webinar titled Global Roots of Independence, which is first in our series India at 75. We'll be bringing some more interesting webinars around this theme. I am Sanjay Kumar, the India Country Director of the Lakshmi, Mittal and Family South Asia Institute at Harvard University, and also serving as the President of the Harvard Club of India. The mission of the Institute is to engage through interdisciplinary research to advance and deepen the understanding of critical issues relevant to South Asia and its relationship with the world. As part of this engagement, the Mittal Institute hosts a multitude of events covering topics in the arts, humanities, sciences, education, business, and more. We are so glad you joined us today, and please consider joining us for our upcoming seminars. A couple of housekeeping items for today. Today's session will be recorded. During the question and answer session, you can submit questions directly to moderators via the Q&A function on Zoom. Due to the large number of attendees at today's seminar, we unfortunately will not be able to cover all questions. Without further ado, I would like to invite Dinyar Patel, who is Assistant Professor of History at SP Jain Institute of Management and Research, and also research affiliate with the Mittal Institute. I would request Dinyar to introduce the topic and the speakers for today. I would also like to welcome and thank Carolien, Stolte, and Nico, Slate, for kindly agreeing to be part of this webinar today. Thank you for being with us today, and over to you, Dinyar.
Thank you, Sanjay. It's a pleasure to be here. Welcome, everyone. So today, myself, Carolien, and Nico will be giving talks related to a rather broad theme, which we think is quite important to emphasize as India approaches the 75th anniversary of its independence, which is, we have a lot of discussion about how India achieved independence. And of course, people like Gandhi and Nehru are individuals who are known on quite a worldwide basis. But what is oftentimes less emphasized are these really important worldwide links which sustain the nationalist movement, really pretty much from its first few years, and picked up pace as India approached independence. So all three of us have conducted research in that particular domain, examining the international aspects of various figures in the Indian nationalist movement. And what we will today be doing is giving a small snapshot of some of our research. In some cases, the research that we present to you today is, from journal articles, and in other cases from larger book projects, but they all fit into our larger research agenda of examining these complex links that spanned everywhere, from India around the world to include the United States, places like Japan, Europe, South Africa, East Africa, and further afield. It really kind of shows you just how broad-minded many of these individuals were who were fighting for Indian independence, and not just broad-minded, but also well-traveled. So I'm going to keep my own intro remarks relatively brief and quick. We will first hear from Nico Slate, and let me introduce Professor Slate. He is a professor in the Department of History at Carnegie Mellon University, joining us today from Pittsburgh, and his research examines struggles against racism and imperialism in the United States and India, and particularly his first book, called Cosmopolitanism, took a really in-depth look into how many of the ties between African American activists and Indian independence leaders were intertwined, and how after independence those ties continued, and kind of the complexity of these relations over time. He's also authored several other books. His most recent work is Lord Cornwallis's Death: The Struggle for Democracy in the United States and in India, which was published by Harvard University Press in 2019. So I'll let Nico begin, and after that we'll hear from Carolien, and I'll present at the very end.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dinyar. I want to thank Sanjay, and I want to thank everyone that has made this event possible. It's a real honor and a privilege to be speaking with you all today. I'm going to go ahead and, if my technical skills allow, share my slides with you all. All right. Dinyar, can you see it on your end? Very good. Excellent. All right. Yes. I think we're set then, friends. I'm going to be speaking today about the experiences of Kamaladevi Chattopadhyay in the United States in the early 1940s, but I'm going to use that as a springboard to look more broadly at the global and transnational dimensions of the Indian independence struggle. Let me start with a story. In the spring of 1941, Kamala Devi sat down in the whites-only section of a segregated train traveling across the American South. Just across the Louisiana border, the train conductor ordered her to move. And she asked him why, and he said, "That is the rule, and you better obey it, or else." She did not move. He went away, studied her for a while, started to realize, oh, wait, maybe she's not African American, and came back and asked her, "Where are you from?" And she replied evasively. She said, "I'm coming from New York." And he said, no, I mean, which land do you hail from?" At this point, Kamala Devi might have said, "Look, buddy, I'm a famous Indian dignitary, friends with Mahatma Gandhi. I just met with the President of the United States and his wife in the White House. I spoke before the United States Congress. I'm obviously a famous person. Get out of my face." Instead, when she's pressed on what land she hails from, Kamala Devi says, "I am a colored woman, obviously, and I refuse to leave my seat." Now, by defining herself as colored, Kamala Devi tapped into a long history in which many different peoples in different parts of the world connected their own racial and national identities with a larger transnational conception of color. One of the key figures in this history is the African-American intellectual and activist W.E. Du Bois, who goes a long way towards popularizing these conceptions of colored solidarity, or what I call colored cosmopolitanism. Now, Kamala Devi doesn't just happen to mention that idea of color once. It's actually a deep part of her self-identity at this moment in time. And you can see that in many of her writings. Let me just give you one example. This is from a text that she publishes about the United States a few years after coming back from her world tour. The key thing about this text, and let me read it to you briefly. The key thing about this text is the way that she uses ideas of color as a bridge between many different forms of injustice and struggles against injustice. She says, "Soon Africa too will come back and come into her own, and the dark ones will cease to be the untouchables of the world. The international color line has been challenged and stormed by Asia. No more the colonials will allow themselves to be Jim Crowed the world over." So she takes ideas like Jim Crow that are usually associated only with the United States. She takes conceptions of untouchability that are usually only associated with caste in the subcontinent, and she links them all to a global conception of anti-colonial struggle against white supremacy. That kind of global conception was crucial to Kamala Devi's travels actually throughout her life. This is an image of her. She's on the far left on my screen here in Berlin in 1929 at an international suffrage association meeting. And I actually think this image is telling. Most of the folks in this image are waving flags and they're joyfully celebrating. Kamala Devi was actually very critical of many European-based international women's organizations and events for not more firmly criticizing imperialism. From Europe, she ends up traveling to many other parts of the world. This is her in Ceylon, contemporary Sri Lanka in the 1930s, where she spoke to massive crowds. After her time in the United States, she actually travels through much of Asia. She spends time in Japan and then goes to China, writes a book about her experiences, actually one about Japan, one about China that we're seeing the cover of here. And that kind of global conception of her identity remains very important to her. This is her at the inauguration of the India International Center, an institution that I expect some of you on the call are actually quite familiar with. She plays a very important role in founding and maintaining that institution. And she continues in her conception of the international to have a special emphasis on what we might call today the global South. So in 1966, for example, she's invited to attend the first World Conference of Negro Arts in Senegal. And she goes out of her way actually to routinely visit different countries in Africa, Asia, and what we often call the Middle East in an effort to create a conception of what was at times called the Third World, earlier what was called the colored world. Let's return to that conception of color and return to the early 1940s and the run-up to Indian independence. This is an image of Kamala Devi with her son Ram. She comes to the United States ostensibly to help settle Ram in a technical education course, but in fact, her real purpose is to try to influence American opinion of India, pull the United States away from its relationship to colonial Britain and towards supporting Indian independence. And she does that in a variety of ways by giving many speeches, traveling all around the country, and influencing many different people. What I want to do is suggest that by looking at Kamala Devi's experiences in the United States, we can actually see at least three, I think there's more, but at least three global dimensions of the Indian independence struggle. The first I've already mentioned, colored cosmopolitanism, and I'll touch again on that very briefly. The second is the relationship of the Indian diaspora to the Indian independence movement. And the third is the importance of nonviolence. And these three, as I said, it's not an exclusive list, and they all intersect in very interesting ways. But let me start by returning to this conception of color and colored solidarity. This is an image from an African-American newspaper just after the launch of the Quit India movement. You see a lot in this image, the figure labeled Britain, egged on by a figure labeled prejudices, wielding an axe labeled Gandhi's arrest, attacking the spinning wheel. And at the base of the spinning wheel, this is the key thing I want to draw your attention to, we see freedom for colored people. So this African-American cartoonist is suggesting that Gandhi's cause and more generally the cause of Indian independence is tied up with the broader struggle of colored peoples for independence throughout the world. Let me be cautious here, friends. These sorts of solidarities weren't always naturally played out in all contexts. This I find an incredibly telling image. What we're seeing here is African-American soldiers in Kolkata during the Second World War. And what we see here is that even within the colored world, there are hierarchies of class, of caste, if you will. And those hierarchies play out in different contexts in really rich and complicated and fascinating ways. I'm happy to talk more about that as we move forward. I don't want to romanticize these conceptions of colored solidarity or other forms of transnational linkage, because in fact, there's always those that are left out, those that are kept down even within these forms of solidarity. And let me give you another example of that, actually, transitioning from colored solidarity into the diaspora. And you'll see there's a linkage here. By looking at the long history of Indian American claims upon whiteness. This is a history some of you will be familiar with, and I'll be very brief. But just to remind us, many South Asian figures in the United States in the first few decades of the 20th century aimed to claim the legal status of whiteness in order to gain citizenship. Citizenship at that time was limited to those born in the US, but then also those that could either be of African descent or who could claim that they were white. So many Indians, including Ake Kumar Majumdar, made a claim on whiteness and did so often by appealing to conceptions of caste and the relationship between caste and race. Majumdar says the high caste Hindus always consider themselves to be members of the Aryan race. The most famous figure that makes this claim is Bhagat Singh Thind, who in his efforts to gain US citizenship through the medium of whiteness argues, quote, the high class Hindu regards the Aboriginal Indian Mongoloid in the same manner as the American regards the Negro, speaking from the matrimonial standpoint. As many of you will know, Thind's efforts to gain citizenship, although at first successful, ultimately are rejected by the Supreme Court in a very important Supreme Court case that sets back actually the entire Indian American community in its quest for civil rights, but also starts to push many Indian American leaders away from claiming whiteness towards claiming solidarity with others that are being discriminated against based on race. So what we see with the Thind case is a kind of break at which notions of color and colored solidarity become increasingly salient, even within the Indian diaspora. Here's a remarkable image. This is from a book that aimed to convince Americans that racial segregation in Washington, D.C. was a foreign policy liability. And what we're seeing is a variety of different examples in which important diplomats or foreign figures of various kinds are discriminated against within Washington, D.C. Now, the only figure in this list that gets an asterisk in order to explain why it's relevant is the so-called Hindu woman who's refused service at a soda fountain. And at the bottom, we see dark-skinned foreigners are often embarrassed. That asterisk is there precisely because Indians remained an in-between case in terms of race within the American context. That's why a figure like Kamala Devi, if she had chosen to, could have actually escaped American racism by distinguishing herself as an Indian foreigner or an Indian diplomat. In this case, in fact, the Hindu woman who's refused service explains that she's from India and she gets an apology and she's actually allowed to have service. But there are many figures like Kamala Devi who are choosing not to identify in those ways. Let me just point out, this is an image actually from Kamala Devi's time in the United States, that she actually often speaks not just on the Indian struggle for independence, but the relationship between that struggle and the so-called colored or darker races. Here we see her, this is an advertisement for a talk she's going to give in New York. And the subject is culture and the future of the darker races. This is a choice that Kamala Devi is making, friends, to locate the Indian independence struggle within a broader struggle against racism in the United States and throughout the world. It's a choice that has become increasingly popular within the Indian diaspora in the United States because of the thin case, but it's still a choice. Many Indian Americans continue to hew towards claims of whiteness, trying to avoid American racism. But Kamala Devi is one of the most outspoken figures suggesting, no, we need to confront racism head on. We need to align ourselves with the struggles of all those that are fighting against imperialism and racism. There are African-American figures at the same time who are fighting in the other direction to link Black struggles with the struggles in India and elsewhere. I'll just touch briefly on the remarkable case of Pauli Murray, who 1 year before Kamala Devi is harassed on that train in New Orleans. Pauli Murray is harassed on a bus in Virginia. She's arrested and produces this remarkable document from March of 1940, where she carefully compares the struggle of the African-American community for freedom within the United States to the struggle of Indians against British colonialism. And you'll see that she underlines up at the top, war without violence. This is an important text in the history of nonviolent struggles. We actually don't have any evidence, I haven't found any yet, that Pauli Murray and Kamala Devi directly connected. I would love it if anyone could find me such a document. But we do know that Kamala Devi linked up with many other important advocates of bridging nonviolence between the Indian struggle and the African-American struggle, including the author of War Without Violence, Krishna Sudharani, who, as a veteran of Gandhi's Salt March, comes to the US and becomes one of the most important intellectual figures, encouraging African-Americans to take up Gandhian nonviolence. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the ways in which Dr. Martin Luther King draws upon Gandhi's legacy. But what the history of Kamala Devi, Krishna Sudharani, Pauli Murray, and many other figures makes clear is that the long history of the transmission of Gandhian nonviolence involved many different figures, many of them women, and that it was bound up with other key ideas that linked the Indian struggle with global dimensions, including, as I've argued, notions of colored solidarity and also conceptions of the Indian diaspora throughout the world. And those three pillars, nonviolence, diaspora, and colored cosmopolitanism, are bound up with other ways in which the Indian struggle is global. And all of those ideas actually are still at play in the world. And just I'll end by suggesting something I can come back to later. But I will suggest that actually the career of Kamala Harris, whose full name some of you will know is Kamala Devi Harris, and I think I can argue there was perhaps some influence there, that Kamala Harris's mother was influenced by the history of Kamaladevi Chattopadhyay in choosing the name, but that's, I don't have any solid evidence of that. We could talk more if there's time. What is clear to me is that we see, even in our world today, the promise and the potential of bridges that link freedom struggles in India, past and present, with freedom struggles in the United States and throughout the world. With that, friends, I will close and say again, thank you so much for this opportunity to share. I'm very excited to learn from the other panelists and also from your questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Nico, for that fascinating presentation. So I'll now turn it over to Carolien Stolte. She is a senior lecturer in history at Leiden University. She's joining us today from the Netherlands. And her research looks at the long trajectory of Afro-Asian connections. And in this case, the really interesting thing about her research is she's looking at them before Indian independence and also after. So her current work, at least, is examining more the period after 1947 and how those connections continued. So with that, let me turn it over to Carolien.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Dinyar. I'm just going to share my screen, hoping that this works. Oh, here we go. Is this visible to everyone? Wonderful. And please let me know if you can't hear me. There's an absolutely raging storm outside my window. So I'm hoping this connection holds. So depending on where everyone is, good morning, afternoon, or evening. And thank you to everyone for being here today. So those who know me know that I've long been fascinated by the absolutely extraordinary life of Mahendra Pratap. And in terms of his ideas, he was a very sort of quixotic outlier in the independence movement, fiercely anti-British, but also staunchly world federationalist rather than nationalist. And nevertheless in contact with everyone from Gandhi and Nehru to the Ghadar Party, Emin Roy, Hardik Dayal, Maulana Baratullah, and basically everyone else. So who was Pratap? Born in Aligarh to the Raja of Mursan, but adopted by the Raja of Hathras and later married into the ruling family of Jind. Pratap's identity as a Raja, as such, was always a complex one, but it served him well, especially in pre- and interwar Europe, in terms of making connections. So Pratap is perhaps best known for the events I've outlined here. He gave away 5 of his villages in trust to establish a fully Indian-run technical college in 1909 in Vrindavan, which actually still exists today. He's also known for his lead role in a German-Turkish mission to Afghanistan and other independent Asian states to convince them to declare war on the British during the First World War, but also as one of the fathers of the INA. So his concept of of an Asian army while staying in Second World War Japan kind of was a precursor to the INA, even though the INA ended up with a leadership structure, with a governance structure that he couldn't get behind, which kind of ended his involvement prior to the actual campaigns. And then finally, after his return to India as an MP for Mathura, beating out future Prime Minister Vajpayee as an independent candidate. So all of these elements of his life are absolutely fascinating, but not what I will talk about today. Because Pratap actually spent over 3 decades, more than 30 years in exile in service of anti-British action, even though his vision of a post-imperial world was atypical even amongst the rather wide range of post-imperial visions of other Indian exiles. And this is what that vision looked like. First thought out by Pratap in Japan and later published in his own periodical, which was also called World Federation. He called this his geography of tomorrow. And I could spend my entire 20 minutes talking just about this map. But for now, I would like to draw your attention to a few key elements. This map shows a federated world state comprised of 5 main administrative divisions, which roughly coincide with continents. And the map itself, quite obviously, is centered on Asia. So his main vision pertained to kind of the future shape of Asia, which was to be renamed the province of Buddha, itself divided into 5 districts: Golden Land, Aryan, Golden Aryan, which is Southeast Asia, Turan, and Arab. Now, each of these 5 districts was to have its own capital, and here things get a little wilder, if they hadn't already, as Pratap tries to reconcile cultural and historical significance with physical accessibility. He is, after all, a traveler. For instance, he wants the capital of this Aryan to be at Karachi, but he wants to rename it Dwarka. And the original Dwarka was to be renamed Dwarka Purani. Now, similarly, the capital of Arab was to be Srinagar, but Srinagar was in turn to be renamed Lhasa. And Lhasa, the actual Lhasa in Tibet, then also was to become Old Lhasa. I'll talk more about the ways in which these get mixed a little bit later. So the province of Turan, meanwhile, was actually an acronym. So it's a T for Turkey, the U for Ukraine, the R for Russia, the A for Siberia, and the N for Turkestan. So this was to be a union of Turkish and Russian-speaking peoples, with Tashkent as its capital renamed as Tur. Now, further afield, you'll find California kind of carved out of the North American map. And this was to be given special status as a capital district as well, and held special significance for Pratap, and I'll talk about that in a moment too. And then finally, the circled islands in the Pacific, marked as heaven, would be the seat of a new world government in this federated world state. So this is Hawaii, and Honolulu was to be that world capital. Now, for reasons you can probably well imagine, this map has been the source of somewhat bewildered fascination for historians, but it has never been taken very seriously, even though Pratap actually continued to consistently advocate for a united Asia as a step towards a federated world until the day he died in 1979. So I actually propose an alternative explanation for the existence of this map. I would argue that this map is actually a fairly accurate representation of Pratap's own revolutionary exile. So we should read it really as a palimpsest, a layered record of his travel experiences, both good and bad, and the companionship he found in South Asian diasporic communities worldwide. So it is really about the interstitial spaces I want to talk today. It's the travel between these key moments that Pratap's view of a post-imperial world order was created. And it's not for nothing that we see Pratap here on this in this picture in his turban, dressed in Bukhara silks, with around his neck the Order of the Red Eagle, which he received from Kaiser Wilhelm during the First World War. So having been on the move for 30 years, Pratap was literally the sum of his travels. So limiting myself to the aspects of the map I just highlighted, let's move to Central Asia with apologies for the contemporary borders here. The area that you see here actually explains a lot about Pratap's vision of world order, as he was not a big fan of sea voyages. Plus, ships were also kind of floating spaces of surveillance, often calling at British-held ports, and Pratap had active arrest warrants against him for most of his years in exile. So he actually traveled the breadth of Eurasia overland many times. And this is how we should sort of physically imagine this. In the top left, Pratap was the figure with the hat on top of the roof of the barge, here crossing the river Euphrates in 1915. And the other photos are from the desert in Iran, soon after, on the way to Afghanistan. Now, I show these here to kind of provide a sense of the immensity of the terrain, the logistics, the hardships involved, but also the danger. Over the years, Pratap was both attacked and rescued by everything ranging from state armies to robbers and warlords. He got typhoid and dysentery. He saw comrades lose limbs and horses collapse, and all without actually ever having a home to return to, right? So this was his world. And this is also why I argue that the roadmap of his exile was also the driver of his politics. The other driver really was diaspora. So though Pratap never settled anywhere for very long, he saw Indian diasporic communities as well as individual Indians choosing a home elsewhere, right, anywhere outside South Asia, as proof of the connectedness of Asia and of the world. So a few examples from Afghanistan and surrounding areas. A Pandit or a Brahmin priest who was suspected as an English spy and whose life I could save by pleading for him with an Afghan governor was too glad to remain behind in the Chinese territory. A Gorkha soldier who had escaped to the Afghan side and was anxious to return home was also left. Our Hindu treasurer and a Sikh friend who had their relations at Kabul took leave to return there. So in his writings, there's always this really strong emphasis on connection and solidarity across communities and religions. And the heart of Asia, despite sort of the vagaries of travel, also recurs in his writing as an oasis. The second quote on the slide here. Gradually, however, luck returned to us again. Beautiful Badakhshan began to sing a lullaby. We found rest. Delicious apples appeased our taste. Nightingales sang songs. Flowers danced in the air to the air of Badakhshan. Our companion Abdul Hadi Khan got married in the adjoining Russian territory. Now, there's another story in this wedding, but the idea that one could travel to Badakhshan and find a familiar Ismaili community was a very romantic notion to Pratap. As he notes, Many of our readers might have heard the name of Sir Aga Khan. Many Indians know him as a Muslim leader. Many Europeans know him as a racing expert. But the fact may not be known generally that he has a big following out here in the Valley of Oxus. My companion, Mr. Abdul Hadi Khan, found his wife among these people at Kharuk. So, as will be evident, the third element that plays into his geography of tomorrow really is religion. So the province of Buddha was purposefully named, right? Same as Pratap's, I'm not sure if you saw that on the map earlier, but Pratap's conflation of Europe with Christ, with at its capital, Geneva, renamed as Holy Ghost, which is all sorts of ironic as the home of Calvin, but that as an aside. Pratap was a strong believer in the fundamental unity of all religions, much like the unity of the world itself. And his idea of a sort of a unified religion of love actually predated his world federationalism. So for him, the principles of renunciation and service central to Buddhism would become the basis for a sort of global religious harmony and a lasting world peace. And he actually often signs his correspondence as world servant. So Tibet and the Dalai Lama at Lhasa therefore occupied an important place in his mind, and his mission to actually reach Lhasa in 1925, 1926 marked a turning point in his exile as well as sort of his international fame. He had raised the money for this mission among the South Asian community in California, who had also supplied him with volunteers for the trip. And to give you a sense of how sort of far-fetched this project was in its conception, the volunteers were all young Sikhs from California, one of whom was actually a UC student, none of whom had passports. And literally the only ship that would take them was a steamer bound for Yokohama, and they actually traveled overland from East Asia in their attempt to reach Tibet. And they met the Panchen Lama in Beijing, who tried to make them understand that they're about to do something very foolish. First of all, they'll never be allowed into Lhasa, but also it's really late in the year, right? And there's going to be snow. So the first two quotes here give a sense of how right the Panchen Lama actually was. And I quote here, "It was bitterly cold. Winter had set in. It was the month of November. We had taken leave of the last shelter. Now we could not expect a roof to cover us. Nights were passed on the frozen ground. Blue sky was our only canopy. Biting winds raged all around us. Dressed in our armor of heavy sheepskins, we were setting the forces of winter at naught. We were riding forth as knights errants in a full stately array. It was a terrible night. To escape the range of robbers who were a terror in the land, we marched all night up to 3 a.m. We were going through snow, marching over ice. It was so cold that the toes of a companion got frostbitten. It was, however, over. That day gave us inestimable joy when after 8 days of hard marches, we saw for the first time Tibetan black tents. Barking of the dogs proved more exhilarating than any band of welcome." So here's this idea again of reaching an oasis that's going to return a little bit later as well. So Lhasa and Chamdo at this point were Tibetan controlled, with a buffer territory with Chinese controlled Tibet and a border with British India, obviously. And after all of the hardship of a Tibetan winter in the mountains, completely stuck, waiting for permission to proceed, the Dalai Lama actually would not proceed them to allow to go to Lhasa to meet him, partly in fear of antagonizing the British. So Lhasa remains this absolutely unattainable place. And I think we can't see this as separate from the fact that this becomes Old Lhasa in Pratap's map, with a more connected place, Srinagar, as the new Lhasa. So Pratap's actually fairly nonchalant in the end about not reaching the real Lhasa. He emphasizes all of the contacts he made with important lamas outside Lhasa, the year they managed to spend in the land of the Buddha, etc., and kind of reconfirms the centrality of Tibet to his geography. Where he says, "For us, Tibet is part of the Golden Land, extending from Tibet to Japan and from Mongolia to Canton. Tibet is the heart of the province of Buddha, or the continent of Asia. It's the roof of the world. Pamir is its extension, a tower in the west. From Tibet, rivers flow out in all directions. Mighty rivers, the Indus, Ganges, Brahmaputra, Yangtze-Kiang, Huangho are all born in this land. The highest mountains in the world, the Himalayas themselves, are rooted in Tibet. Then Tibet guards the treasures of living Buddhism." But you will remember that it was actually the Indian community in California that had funded this trip. And it is to this community that he must also justify both the expense and the very limited results. So here it does help that the mission was publicized as a volunteer peace mission, and even earned Pratap a nomination for the Nobel Peace Prize by a Swedish peace organization. And so armed with this, Pratap returns to San Francisco. And it is the Ghadar headquarters in San Francisco that is actually one of the few places in the world in which Pratap ever felt truly welcome, even though at times they were highly critical of his political exploits. The Ghadar network, sort of in and through San Francisco, was also how Pratap received intel on the general state of the anti-imperialist movement, other initiatives that were going on, but also where he informed much of his ideas on diasporic placemaking. So in fact, all of his mentions of visiting gurdwaras are from San Francisco and a few from Vancouver, as shown by the first quote here on the screen. Oh, sorry, there we go. But San Francisco was also where Pratap lost one of the comrades closest to him, which was Maulana Baratullah, another committed Pan-Asianist who, even though their respective politics were actually rooted in very different traditions, had accompanied him to quite literally all continents. And the final quote here on the slide shows how in Barattullah's funeral, kind of the best and the worst of diasporic placemaking in terms of emotional significance come together. But our Maulana Baratullah was sinking quick. Diabetes was taking him down, and he passed away in September. I acted as his closest relative. In his funeral, Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs equally took part and prayed according to their respective religions. It was a memorable day. Dr. Said Hussain, Dr. Rahmat Ali Khan, Mr. Puran Singh, Mr. Godaram, the Granthiji of the Sikh temple, hundreds of our Indian friends all expressed their hearty regards to the departing revolutionary leader. I could not now do much in California. I had no heart to stay there any longer. So this is a bit of a breaking point. Pratap left California after Barattullah's funeral and indeed did not return there for a very long time. So he spends some time reflecting on the life of Indian revolutionary exiles, and he recalls an earlier meeting that he had with Emin Roy, where he tells us how Emin Roy actually advised him to go back to India. And Emin Roy told Pratap, and this was a couple of years before this happened, that they can't hang you. The worst they can do is throw you in jail for a few years, but then you would be free to serve the people. And on the contrary, Pratap tells us, Baratullah actually advised him never to return to a captive India, and telling him it's better to die abroad. And then Pratap writes shortly after Baratullah passed away, it's interesting to reflect today that both these gentlemen followed themselves what they told me. Mr. Emin Roy is now free in India after his term in prison of 6 years, and Maulana Baratullah is lying in the bosom of Mother Earth in California. So as was Pratap's custom, his circumnavigations of the globe are invariably in a westward direction. He left California on a steamer bound for Japan. Which brings me back to my brings me to my final point about the significance of travel to Pratap's ideas, and that is the Oasis. So, as someone who really disliked long sea voyages, stopovers in Hawaii were indeed Pratap's very own idea of heaven. And as he noted, people who haven't traveled through a desert cannot understand the joy of arriving at an oasis. It's perhaps the privation which makes the plenty sweet and sweeter. So this was as true to Pratap for a Central Asian desert as it was for the Pacific. And he describes first laying eyes on Hawaii as it appeared to us as an oasis in a great desert, and then heaven on earth revealed to us. I enjoyed the drive up and down the beautiful island. So Pratap also loved kind of sharing the significance of Hawaii to him. So on his way to Tibet, on the Tibetan mission, he also shows all of the young Sikh volunteers from California around in Honolulu and accompanied them all around the island. So in all, these are really but a few examples, but other stopovers on Pratap's journeys of exile actually map onto this World Federation map in similar ways. But for now, suffice to say that Pratap left California for Yokohama, contacted Raspberry Bois, and spent the next couple of years in East Asia, alternating between China and Japan. He found publishers willing to distribute his World Federation periodical, and basically turned for a while to propagating his ideas in writing rather than living them. And this is how we return to the map. So I think it's important that a neater version of the map than this was never published, right? This is literally how it appeared in print in World Federation. And I actually think it's quite fitting that it retains the look of a set of field notes made on the go as a testament to the importance of the act of traveling and the companionship that Pratap found on the road. And I'll close there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carolien, for that presentation. It's really quite incredible to see just how his ideas developed from travel. And again, I mean, it really elucidates that theme of how travel in many ways really shaped a lot of the political ideas that were developing amongst Indians, no matter where they were. And as a native Californian, I particularly like that he sketched out California as his own separate place. So let me go ahead and talk. Use both Nico and Carolien's presentations to talk to you about kind of the last big figure in our series today. Just give me a second to load up my presentation. Can everyone see? Good. Okay. As Sanjay mentioned, I'm a professor at the SV Jain Institute of Management and Research in Mumbai. It is also thundering and lightning right now, so hopefully connection will be maintained. I'm going to look at an aspect of the Indian nationalist movement in America, particularly a moment in time that coincided with the Second World War, and how Indian nationalists abroad really fit into a lot of the themes that both Carolien and Nico talked about: travel, the diaspora, and how these themes were yoked for supporting the Indian independence movement. And let me take you to into the archives, if you will, to look at some images that I came across while doing some research at the New York Public Library. So I was sitting in the research room in the New York Public Library, and I came across material like this in some files I was looking at. This is a sheet from 1942, which provides you with instructions on how to make the Gandhi Cap, right? The Gandhi topi that people would wear in the 20s, 30s, and 40s to denote their following the Indian National Congress. This was a sheet that was distributed by something called the Fellowship of Reconciliation, a church-based international pacifist organization, and it was meant to instruct people, in New York and really around the U.S. How to make a Gandhi cap in order to celebrate Gandhi's birthday on October the 2nd. And it encouraged members to do stuff like have a special dinner where you'd invite family members and friends to celebrate Gandhi's birthday. And it said specifically, the dinner should be kept very simple, only soup or fruit or milk to conform to Gandhi's dietary details. And students especially were encouraged to wear these Gandhi caps while going to school. So presumably you have a few school children in places like Manhattan or even elsewhere in the US wearing these caps, around October 1943. Here's another document from the New York Public Library, a flyer that was distributed, kind of encouraging people to come out and support Indian independence, and specifically telling President Roosevelt to support American independence. And you see that the highlighted phrase over here, an explicit comparison is made between Indian independence and American independence. This flyer says, in 1776, Great Britain did not think our 13 colonies could govern themselves, and in a similar manner, the British are being obstructionist in order to allow India to get its Indian independence. Now, this particular, attempt to kind of, publicize Indian independence took place around 1942, 1943. These were significant years because the Indian National Congress leadership had been put behind bars after the Quit India movement, post-August 1942. So the Congress leadership was effectively muzzled, right? So a lot of activism took place outside of the traditional mechanisms for nationalist organization, including in places like the United Kingdom or indeed the United States. So documents like this show the evidence of nationalist activities abroad in the United States and in the diaspora in general, but also show you how Americans were brought into this process as well. I mean, there were Americans who go and protest outside the British consulates in places like Chicago, outside the British embassy. So there's a very complex story of American involvement during the Second World War. In places like New York, Chicago, San Francisco, etc., campaigning for Indian independence. And a lot of this activity was coordinated by a man called J.J.Singh, who I'll be talking more about in the course of my presentation. So as the two presentations before me have shown, Mahatma Gandhi was far from being the only individual who used the Indian diaspora and travel and extraterritorial links to work for Indian nationalist activities. And Singh was, again, a classic example. He built on decades of Indian involvement with American political networks, I mean, stretching back to really the 1890s, to build up support amongst various different constituencies for Indian independence. So, unlike many earlier activists in America, who built up links specifically within, say, a leftist progressive elite in places like New York, Singh went further. He brought in African Americans, he brought in farmers, he brought in progressive college students in places like Ohio. He brought in people who are, in the South, people in California, Indians, as well as, regular Americans, people of all different ethnic backgrounds. This was particularly important after the year 1942, when again, Singh felt that since people like Nehru and Gandhi were now behind bars, it was up to people like him who were free and at liberty to really take the activism of the Congress movement forward and campaign for Indian independence. So from 1942 onwards, Singh really becomes very prominent in orchestrating, a nationalist movement activity that, was connected not just with activities going on in India, but also in places like the United Kingdom, where D.K. Krishna Menon was campaigning for Indian independence over there. So there's really kind of a global linkage that is created through people such as Singh. Now, who was this man? J.J.Singh or Jagjit Singh. He was born into a relatively wealthy and successful Punjabi family. His father was an official in the British Indian government. He joined Congress activities around the 1920s in line with the beginning of Gandhi's non-cooperation movement, but he soon decides to go abroad. By 1927, he had relocated to the United States, and he moved to New York, where he set up a very successful clothing business. So somewhere on Fifth Avenue in the 1920s and 1930s, there was this man who was selling Indian textile goods, as fashion items to, high-profile gentlemen and gentlewomen, if you will, in New York. And at the same time, he developed a pronounced love for aspects of American and particularly New York or Manhattan-centric culture. He loved swing dancing. He was a fan of nightlife in Manhattan. He liked Broadway plays. He enjoyed playing tennis. So he was really in many ways kind of the prototypical example of, your modern day Indian American, someone who was at home both equally in the United States and in India. As this particular profile in the New York Post pointed out in 1943, he preferred steaks to the Indian food found in New York, and we can imagine the Indian food in New York was pretty terrible at this time. But he was someone who was quite willing to engage in all aspects of Indian culture, of American culture. But at the same time, he retained very strong links with the Indian political establishment in India. And when you look at his papers, which are really scattered around the world, kind of like his activities, I mean, some of his papers are in London, some in Delhi, and some are in New York or Washington, D.C., you get a flavor of what it was like to be an Indian in America at this time. We know that in Manhattan, there were at least 2 Indian restaurants in the 1940s. And here's, a letterhead of one such Indian restaurant called the Raj, and it was located on, I think somewhere in Midtown at this time. There were about 5,000 Indians living in America, perhaps a few hundred in New York, and especially in Manhattan. And these individuals really ran the gamut of all different socioeconomic classes. Some of them were, quite well off, like J.J.Singh, but many of them were relatively poor farmers in places like the Central Valley or the Imperial Valley in California. Within Manhattan, the New York, within New York, the Indian population was known for being extremely fractious and argumentative. And oftentimes they fought furiously over their political activities. And this was a problem because, in 1937, a group of them formed something called the India League of America. And what they do for the first 2 years or so is just fight amongst each other. So much so that Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay, when she comes to New York in around 1939, 1940 or so, she actually sits them down and says, look, stop fighting. You need to all cooperate if you want to coordinate political activity. And this is really what happens from 39, 40 onward. J.J.Singh emerges as the main leader of this organization. And he really kind of takes the organization, which up until this time had been mostly composed of diasporic Indian leaders, people like Krishna Sudharani, another Punjabi exile called Anup Singh, who J.J.Singh had a lot of arguments with, people like Taraknath Das, who'd been in the US for many decades. He took this organization and he really expanded its scope and form in many ways. He brought in, again, people like African Americans, Chinese American representatives of freedom movements from other countries like Indonesia or Vietnam. He expanded kind of this pool of individuals who are campaigning for liberation in their own homelands. And this allowed people like J.J.Singh to establish really broad-ranging international linkages whenever they put together activities. So as you can see in this particular flyer celebrating Gandhi's birthday, you not only have prominent Indians like Singh or Sridharani, you also have pretty well-known Americans, but you also have a Chinese American, Mai Si, who was the daughter of a Chinese diplomat and an accomplished Chinese artist and writer in her own regard. So there were, again, these transnational links that were on the ground in places like New York that buttressed Indian nationalist activities. So what Singh is able to do by the mid-1940s, while campaigning for some measure of Indian independence, albeit while being abroad in New York, was really bring on board these heavyweights that gave him links to all these other constituents. So you had people like Walter White, a member of the NAACP. You had representatives of the American Civil Liberties Union. You had union workers like Walter Reuther of the United Auto Workers, famous authors and writers, Paul S. Buck, the Nobel laureate, Henry Luce, his wife, Claire Booth Luce, who was a representative in the Congress, and also representatives from the Democratic Party, people like Emanuel Seller, who was a representative from Brooklyn. And then again, you had these other international links, people like Lin Yutang, who had ties with the Kuomintang government, the nationalist government in China. So these really broad-ranging ties are developed. And with these ties, Singh really concentrates on two methodologies to get the message out to Americans about the need for India to get its independence, and not just get its independence eventually, but during the war. Singh felt very strongly that immediate independence for India would not only help the war effort, but it would really kind of solidify a lot of the activities which the Allies were supposedly fighting for: democracy, anti-fascism, equality, reducing the color line around the world. And he did this through two classically American tactics. One was publicity. Singh mastered the art of American public relations. This is something that he wrote to Jawaharlal Nehru just after the war, once Nehru had been released from prison. Quote, "This country in particular lives on publicity. And when you have lived here as long as I have, you learn the full value of publicity." So he was skilled in the arts of advertisement and getting your message out through the print and radio and such. The India League actually brought on board publicity experts, a man called Sidney Hertzberg, who had been involved in publicity and the New York Socialist Party and also other organizations, really built up the public relations engine of the organization through the 1940s. And the India League published its own newsletter, something called India Today. It participated in radio broadcasts that got its message well, beyond the borders of Manhattan. And the other classically American thing that Singh started to engage in was lobbying, going to Capitol Hill, talking to senators and congressmen, spending long hours in their offices, and getting them to support his programs. So not only were people like Claire Booth Luce or Emmanuel Seller involved in this program of lobbying, so were people far afield from the Eastern Seaboard. So one of Singh's closest allies was a man called Carl E. Munt. And Munt was the Republican congressman from South Dakota. So here you have a South Dakotan representative, who's brought on board and really helps cultivate a lot of ties with Indian nationalist leaders in the United States and brings that support to the floor of the House of Representatives in Washington, D.C. So through these methodologies, Singh is able to kind of put the agenda of the Indian National Congress before different American platforms. And the way that he characterizes Indian nationalist demands is very unique. Up until this time, when people talked about Gandhi, they talked about him as being kind of, representing something, opposing Western civilization, opposing, particular aspects of Western culture, and Singh completely dispenses with the strategy. He instead, really regards Gandhi and Nehru, and he portrays Gandhi and Nehru as leaders equivalent to people like Abraham Lincoln or George Washington or even Thomas Paine. So when he describes people like, the Indian nationalist leadership to American audiences, he makes these equations to people who Americans understand. When Americans ask him about communalism in India, he says, well, here in the United States, we of course have the same problem with regard to the way that African Americans are treated, and look at the Civil War that happened in the United States, and yet people were able to patch up their relations, and in a similar way, Hindus and Muslims will be able to kind of carry out their own agenda and resolve their own differences. And he really puts a lot of Indian nationalist ideas in an American political vocabulary. So he celebrates Indian Independence Day. January 26th was regarded as Indian Independence Day well before India actually achieved independence, or before there was something called Republic Day, because on the 26th of January of 1929, the so-called Puran Swaraj resolution had been passed, which declared that India was to achieve full independence, and a Declaration of Indian Independence was written up. And Singh would present the Declaration of Indian Independence side by side with the American Declaration of Independence in publicity programs, and he include commentary like this that he says in a newsletter from 1943. In her Declaration of Independence, India seeks the same opportunities that the original 13 United States took to build a nation dedicated to justice and equal representation for all. Now, at the same time, Singh very clearly wanted to portray India as a potential arsenal for democracy in the fight against fascism. So he put together a clear message saying that if India is granted independence during the war, it would gladly join the Allied war effort and put its fighting potential to the forefront. And he was very clear in warning Americans that if America, does not support Indian independent aspirations, and if Britain continues to put India in colonial bondage throughout the war, in the off chance that Japan would succeed in conquering India, well, then it might take anywhere from 3 to 4 million American lives to liberate India. So here's a very clear declaration of why it was important for Americans to be concerned about Indian independence. Potentially the mothers and fathers of 3 to 4 million American sons could risk their children's lives being sacrificed in a war effort that could be avoided if only Britain would allow India to fight on its own terms on behalf of the Allies. So this was pretty potent and heady stuff. And Singh and his colleagues put this out in the public through advertisements in places like the Washington Post, encouraging people to write to FDR and the White House in order to, campaign for Indian independence. Singh took the battle against British wartime propaganda, to the front pages of dailies and through to the radio broadcasts in America. So, there were times when Singh would engage in debates with people like Henry S.L. Pollock. Pollock was, a friend of Gandhi from his South African days, but, in his most recent avatar, he was a propagandist for the British government in America, campaigning for, against, the argument that India should get its independence during the wartime. And Singh engaged in, furious radio debate with Pollock on American airwaves. British propagandists who are trying to spread their own message about why India should not achieve independence immediately felt themselves a little threatened by this band of small band of Indian immigrants, and they tried their best to hit back against this organization. They did so by trying to infiltrate this organization, by trying to get the American government to investigate it, by trying to get the FBI and the Department of Justice to potentially investigate this organization and shut it down, but also through some quite underhanded tactics. They tried to import a lot of Indian communalist organizations to American soil. There are some passages in British intelligence documents which say that, just like the Hindu Mahasabha and the Muslim League have tried to challenge the Congress line in India, let's try to do something similar in the United States. Let's actively support bringing Sabha or Muslim League propagandists to America to present an alternative line to the Congress and kind of compete against the India League to present an alternative vision, and thereby show that the India League or the Congress, which were conflated in the eyes of the American public at this time, do not represent the only political agenda that Indians would support. So again, quite a stark example of how communalist tactics were used abroad by the British government. All of this shows you that the British government was scared by the capabilities of this small little organization that ran its offices out of some small office space on East 49th Street in Midtown Manhattan. And there were a few places where the British government and its representatives in America and the India League came head to head. And the India League won some pretty clear victories. One was during the Bengal famine. Starting in early 1943, news starts to leak out of the occurrence of famine in Bengal, and it reaches places like the United States. And the India League plays a role in publicizing what was going on in India and spreading messages to political leaders and getting people to sign letters to people like FDR. At the same time, it succeeds in getting the United States Congress to pass legislation that would allow Bengal to be put under the ambit of the United Nations in famine relief. This was done against the opposition of both the British government and the British Indian representative, Girija Shankar Bajpai, in Washington, D.C. Its campaign for famine relief continued well after the Bengal famine. So, up through Indian independence, there was always the lingering fear of Indian famine, and the India League organized efforts to promote famine relief and publicize the need for famine relief that was carried in American newspapers and journals. You see another such pamphlet over here. Really, perhaps its most spectacular victory happened again around this time, around 1943, 1944, when it leaks, it helps leak a series of documents that show that an American diplomat who was stationed in New Delhi, William Phillips, who was quite Anglophile, was quite pro-British, had been so disillusioned with the state of British Indian administration that he had come to the conclusion that America must champion for immediate independence for India. FDR had to put pressure on people like Churchill and others to give India independence. That was the only way that India would be able to be kept in the war effort in a really positive and productive way. So once the members of the India League learn about this document, they do their best to get it leaked. They had contacts within the British Embassy on Connecticut Avenue in Washington, D.C., and other contacts in British legations in places like New York. This document is leaked to the Washington Post and causes a complete diplomatic furor, which really kind of coalesces a lot of American opinion around the idea that the British handling of India was so bad that it was actually hurting the war effort. So let me conclude by talking about what the India League does, after the war. It really transitions into an organization that helps, improve the conditions of Indian Americans. So there's something called the Loose Seller Act, which is passed in 1946, which is really the first, legislation to allow a small stream of Indians into America as immigrants. And, one of the main figures behind the Loose Seller Act was, again, J.J.Singh. He campaigned, absolutely, tirelessly in Capitol Hill for this legislation to be passed. He gets people like W.E. Du Bois and Walter Reuther and African Americans to support this legislation. And it reverses, what Nico Slate had talked about earlier, this decision from the Supreme Court, U.S. versus Bhagat Singh Hind from 1923, and it sets the stage for further immigration reform, namely the Hot Seller Act in 1965. There's also the function of introducing Indian leadership to American audiences. So the India League introduces people like Kamala Devi or Nehru and others to American leaders and the American public at large. And it also sets the ground for future US-India relations. Before America is home to an Indian embassy, the India League really functions as the embassy or the headquarters of Indian nationalist leadership, Congress, and eventually what becomes transitions into becoming the Indian embassy in Washington D.C. and its consul in New York. There's a lot of overlap between these organizations. And lastly, what it does is it really takes these broader global roles that India had chalked out for itself in global anti-colonialism and champions it further. So, after the war is over, once Indian independence is in sight, people like J.J.Singh campaign for the rights of Indians in places like South Africa, or do things like this, send telegrams to Clement Attlee, the Prime Minister in London, talking about how they protested how Indians were being used to kind of buttress French colonialism or Dutch colonialism in places like Vietnam or Indonesia. So once Indian independence had been secured in 1947, people like Singh transitioned to campaigning for Indonesian independence, Vietnamese independence, and the rights of Indians as well as Africans in places like South Africa. So once again, bringing these kind of global orientations of Indian nationalism to the fore. So with that, I will end my presentation. Thank you very much to patiently listening to all of us. I see that we have a few questions, or at least one or two questions already. So let me just read out the first question, which I think is probably directed to Nico. Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay turned down every offer Nehru made to her to be ambassador and cabinet minister, amongst others. How do you assess her reluctance for any high-profile position in India and for India, and instead to focus more on handloom workers and grassroots workers?
That's an excellent question, and it's one that allows us to reflect on the relationship between Kamala Devi's life pre-Indian independence and post-Indian independence, the relationship between the anti-colonial struggle and struggles against other forms of oppression and inequity after India gains independence. I'd say the short answer is that Kamala Devi is not entirely opposed to engaging with Indian politics after independence. Indeed, she runs for parliament as a socialist, and there's actually some really remarkable and interesting letters between Nehru and local Congress officials in Bombay, where Kamala Devi's running. Nehru basically says, I don't think we should run anyone against her because she's too important a figure from the independence struggle, even though she's not running as a Congress figure. it doesn't behoove us to run anyone against her. And the local officials end up sort of rejecting that advice. They do run someone against her and she loses. Kamala Devi loses. So she tries to get involved in electoral politics, and she is open to taking on government positions, including, as the question mentions, in regards to arts and crafts. She's actually wears many different government or government-related hats in the All India Handicrafts Board and the various academies that are set up to promote the arts in independent India. But she does become very concerned about the direction of politics after Indian independence. And I find it actually one of the most beautiful parts about her life arc is that in many ways she becomes increasingly Gandhian. You know, in the 1930s and 1940s, there are lots of tensions between Gandhi and Kamala Devi that focus on his views of women and the role of women in the movement, that focus on his own personal views of the fact that she opts to be divorced at a time when that's a very rare thing. So the two figures, you know, they butt heads at various junctures, but they also profoundly respect each other. And over time, Kamala Devi becomes more and more committed to certain Gandhian philosophies and principles, including the importance of making things with one's hands and having an economy in India that is decentralized, that creates opportunities for people in the villages on the local level to earn income through their own manual labor in a way that is dignified and that respects them as producers and as artists. So there's a deep Gandhian dimension to her turn towards arts and crafts, but it is also in part a rejection of what she sees as the increasingly corrupt and broken nature of Indian bureaucracy, and so it's. I see there's at least three strands here. There's that she finds her own efforts to get into politics frustrated. She has this increasing respect for Gandhian emphasis on handmade products and creating things with the hands, and she becomes increasingly critical of the failures of the Indian state in the post-independence period. That's my short answer. It's a beautifully big question, and I'd love to talk more, but I want to pause to give space for other questions.
So I'd like to encourage audience members to ask questions. You can write your questions in the Q&A box. While we don't have a question right now, let me ask a question perhaps to both of you, which is, for both Mahendra Pratap and Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay, what was what was the sense or the idea that both individuals had about India's role in the world? I mean, post-independence, what role would India play?
I'll let you go first.
Oh, that is actually, when it comes to Pratap, that's an intensely complex question, because Pratap actually spends much of his time in a way decentering India a little bit. He really wants this united Asia thing to get off the ground. And interestingly, when he returns to India, so this might actually, if you will allow me, be a really good opportunity to talk a little bit about kind of the afterlife of Pratap's politics here. So I mentioned he was nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize. He's in 1945, he's actually interned by the Americans because he's still in Japan by that time on suspicion of war crimes, and possibly one of the only people I can think of who kind of had both of those things, right? The Nobel Peace Prize nomination and being interned in the space of a few decades. So he becomes a intensely difficult case for the Nehru government, because you have this person who spent the Second World War in Japan and is interned by the Americans, and then the question is raised: do we bring Pratap back? Do we actually put in the effort to bring back this person with, in the eyes of many, highly suspect ideas, and spent a lot of political capital at a time where that is very precious and rare in bringing him back? Or do we kind of turn him a martyr by making his exile indefinite? And it's really sort of a choice between two very difficult options. And the Nehru government actually decides to spend a lot of effort and political capital in bringing Pratap back. And what Pratap ends up doing is organizing something he calls the Freedom Fighters Conference. And in Delhi, he actually tries to create a sort of retroactive unity in the independence movement by bringing revolutionaries from all sorts of different directions together in kind of a single advisory organ, and they try to sort of give foreign policy advice to the Nehru government, and this is successful in varying degrees, but there's they're actually kind of well wired into the to Nehruvian politics in the early era. So in that sense, Pratap does kind of continue to put a stamp on the place of India in the world in that way, but he continues to advocate for kind of eventually dissolving the Indian nation into a Pan-Asian union, and obviously that there's no Venn diagram in which that coincides with post-independence politics. So in that sense, he kind of recedes from view.
I can build on that briefly. Although I wonder, did Pratap and Kamala Devi cross paths? Do you know of any examples of that?
Yes, but not in a very significant way. So Pratap actually spent some time working with Virendranath Chattopadhyay, right? And they all crossed paths in Europe shortly after the first conference of the League Against Imperialism in Brussels. So this is late 2030s in Europe. Yeah.
Okay. All right. We'll have to talk more about that.
He's closer to Chatto, as in the
yes.
Chatto, than to Kamala Devi.
That makes sense. Okay. Well, in regards to Kamala Devi, she remains a very fiery Indian nationalist all the way through, and certainly has a strong conception of India's unity and of the importance of India on the world stage. But she nests it in a variety of larger conceptions of solidarity. So first within Asia, she has a strong conception of an Asian identity. And then within what was called at various points the colored world, the dark world, the third world, the global south, she's very committed to that as well. And then also she has conceptions of world government. She participates in this organization that's set up, I can't remember the exact title, but something about World Federation. She, buys into an idea of she's very critical of the UN, although she does serve briefly for 1 year in an organization, the Human Rights Council based in Geneva. But she's critical of the UN, but she still has hope for some form of world government, but in a way that wouldn't trample upon the sovereignty of independent nations. So she tries to balance her Indian nationalism with a conception of transnationalism that operates on multiple scales.
Can I just ask, can you hear me? Sorry, I'm having some connection issues over here. Good. Okay.
Yes.
So let me just add to that by talking a little bit about what J.J. Singh's own views were. I mean, Singh remained in the United States through 1959. So he stayed in New York and then moved after 1959 back to India, where he lived in Delhi until he passed away in the 1970s. And about 2 or 3 years ago, I was able to meet one of his sons. So the family still lives there, and his wife actually only passed away perhaps maybe about 4 or 5 years ago. So there's a lot of stuff within living memory about his life. But the sense I got from studying his life and also talking to his children is that since he had these kind of dual American Indian identities, he had a lot of interest in what the future of US-India relations would be like. He wanted them to be good, and obviously, as we know, in the 50s and definitely thereafter, in the 60s and 70s, there were very rocky moments. And Singh really tried to kind of intervene and kind of help smooth out relations. So things like, the specter of communism in South Asia, whenever people like, John Foster Dulles or such would, raise their hands and say, what is going on in India? Why is Nehru sounding so socialist? Or, why is there such a burgeoning communist movement in certain places? Singh would kind of tamp down things and say, no, actually, committed towards democracy, and this is only one particular aspect of the democratic spectrum in India. So he really tried to play a mediating role in kind of smoothing out U.S.-India relations. But he did also see a much broader role for India beyond just the United States as well. I mean, he developed ties again with V.K. Krishna Menon in London, and he took several world tours where both before and after Indian independence, he would kind of talk about India's relations with different parts of the world, places like China or the Soviet Union or parts of Europe. So like I think Chattopadhyay and Mahendra Pratap Singh, he was well traveled, and that ability to travel and see different perspectives, I think, really helped kind of broaden his mind about what India was in the greater scheme of things. So I see we still do not have any other questions from the audience. Let me ask Nico and Carolien, were there any questions which came to mind about the other presentations or anything else?
I have one I can throw out, and then just maybe because we're so close to Gandhi Jayanti, I'd be curious to hear you both talk about how Gandhi figures into these stories. What does Pratap make of Gandhi, and what does J.J.Singh make of Gandhi? And the Gandhi as a figure looms so large in these years. And I'd be curious to know how he plays into these other histories.
That's a wonderful question, actually. And there's just I don't want to throw it right back to you, but something that struck me in both of your talks was actually Krishna Sudharani coming up, and his books on sort of peace and Gandhiism, because I feel like he's kind of a hidden fourth person that we're circling around, right? Because for so many Americans and indeed Europeans, Quakers, pacifists, sort of peace lovers as they were known at the time the world over, he was kind of their introduction to Gandhiism, right? And I feel like he's really one of those kind of under-recognized characters in terms of the importance of his publications for everyone from Paul Robeson to the Quakers who end up singing ashrams in the 1960s and kind of joining the Cold War era peace movement that way. So I really, I was struck by the fact that he made an appearance in both your papers in that sense. But for Pratap, he had an intensely complex relationship with Gandhi. And this had much to do with the fact that Gandhi doesn't much like Pratap. I think it's very safe to say that there's correspondence between the two. The letters between them are preserved by the National Archives of India in Delhi, and Gandhi feels that Pratap's journey of exile and the way in which he kind of publicizes his travels and his exploits is way too self-aggrandizing. Right? He doesn't believe Pratap is the world servant. He kind of makes himself out to be. He feels it's the whole project is too self-serving. So Gandhi actually sends this beautiful letter to Pratap, which I really think is absolutely fascinating, in which he kind of asks Pratap to direct all of this time and effort, and the fact that Pratap has kind of renounced everything and devoted his life to the service of the people. Like, stop traveling, like settle in one place and just be a servant. I don't care what you do, like start shining people's shoes, wash feet. I don't, but yeah, do some actual service. So Gandhi doesn't quite believe in Pratap's project and is not afraid to say that.
Yeah, so with regard to J.J.Singh, again, the relations with Gandhi were a little fraught. I have a sense that J.J.Singh, one of the reasons why he left Congress politics in the first place in the 1920s is because of his disillusionment with Gandhi's calling off of non-cooperation movement in 22. And thereafter, Singh was someone who identified much more with Nehru. He almost worshipped Nehru, quite frankly. I mean, he wrote letters to Nehru that pretty much said that. And he fiercely defended Nehru and did a lot of work on his behalf in the United States. He helped get Nehru's autobiography published in the United States by John Day. That was one of the first big political things that he does. So he's much closer to Nehru than Gandhi. But at the same time, Gandhi and Singh do seem to have some correspondence. I mean, I found at least one letter where Gandhi congratulates Singh for his work in getting the Loose Seller Act passed, helping it get passed in 1946. And Gandhi, as a good lawyer, asks for a copy of the legislation. He wants to read it. So, that in a nutshell gives you a sense of the relationship that the two men had. Not as extensive, nowhere near as extensive as Singh's relations with Nehru. So we do have two questions now. One is to Nico. Can you elaborate on how, by claiming whiteness, some Indians in the diaspora were able to avoid racism?
Sure, I will be brief given our time. It's a very good question. As I mentioned passingly earlier, the naturalization law at that point in the United States history said that there were really only two paths for people who were not born in the US to become citizens. One was to demonstrate that they were of African descent. That's a legacy of the Civil War. And the other was to demonstrate that they were white. And that was actually the term that was used. It goes way back in US legal history. But how does one define whiteness? That was a very complex question that involved a lot of the pseudoscience of the day. And it often involved claims on the word Aryan or the word Caucasian. These are both key words that come into play. And many Indians were able to deploy what were quite popular ideas at that point about the fundamental Aryan identity of particularly Northern Indian higher caste people, right? So there was a regional dimension to this, and there was a caste dimension to this. So if I'm from the North and I'm higher caste, then I can claim I am Aryan, and thus that makes me Caucasian, and thus that makes me white. That was the argument that people like Majumdar deployed quite successfully. So there are dozens of Indian Americans who are naturalized on the basis of successful claims to whiteness, often in quite remarkable legal proceedings. Judges ask people to roll up their shirt sleeves to show their skin where it hadn't been darkened by the sun. In one legal case, a particular figure successfully gains whiteness by demonstrating that he had been allowed to purchase a plot in a whites-only cemetery. So there's all sorts of different ways in which figures claim their whiteness, but it's successful until the Bhagat Singh Thind case, when the Supreme Court says, no, actually, the common man would not see Indian migrants as white, and thus they are not white. And that then becomes retroactively used to take away the citizenship of many Indian Americans. And that has catastrophic consequences because in many states, including California, the law does not allow people to own land who are not able to become citizens. So it has huge both political and economic consequences for many Indian Americans.
Thank you. So we have one last question, and this might allow us to talk a little bit more about our work. We can do so briefly. How do we access these papers or books if they are in book form? So I'll just very quickly just say from my part, the paper that I've written on J.J.Singh is to be published in the Journal of Imperial and Commonwealth Studies. So, if you have an academic connection, it's available through there. I've written a book on Dadabhai Naoroji, who was another very globe-spanning Indian leader. So both Carolien and Nico, if you want to talk about where your work has been published.
Yes, that's a very kind question, actually. So I have one paper out on Pratap that I wrote many years ago in modern Asian studies. Pratap's writings are prolific as well, but less so in the public domain. Those kind of has to be pieced together from various libraries. So what I'm actually working on right now is a biography of K.M. Panikkar, who was also a very well-traveled, wide-ranging Indian leader, but sort of using his various identities as a diplomat, as an academic, as a politician, to shed light on his geographies of Asia and the Indian Ocean. My post 47 book, which I wrote together with Sulin Lewis of Bristol University, is coming out next year with Leiden University Press, which is called The Lives of Cold War Afro-Asianism.
I am really excited to read that book. In terms of my work, I've written about Kamala Devi, both in the two books that Dinyar mentioned earlier, Lord Cornwallis is Dead, and in Colored Cosmopolitanism. And I'm now at work on a biography of her that I hope will emerge in a year or so.
Great. So we are out of time, right on time, in fact. So I want to thank both Carolien and Nico for being a part of this panel. It's really wonderful to hear about both of your work, and we hope through the Mittal Institute to highlight some more work on history in this upcoming year. Thanks also to Sanjay, to Salman and Namita for helping organize this event and all the technical details. And with that, we'll close today's presentation. Thanks to everyone for listening in.